Hello, this is Mrs. Brown from Research Triangle High School. The purpose of this presentation is to take a look at some ways that you can read and evaluate arguments when you're looking at a passage on a final exam. So this presentation is basically about how to become a more effective critical reader so that you can evaluate arguments when you see them. Now, to evaluate an argument, when an argument is a set of claims, you have to determine its value or its persuasiveness. To do a good job at evaluating arguments, you need to first of all know what an argument is. We're not talking about drama that starts because of something somebody said on Twitter, but about a literary or an informational argument. And you need to understand how that argument is put together. So simply speaking, an argument is a claim, something that someone's trying to say, and it's supported by reasons and by evidence. So it's when an author is trying to persuade the reader and trying to prove you that something is true based on supporting reasons and evidence that they supply. So this means that an argument is different from just a statement. I can just say something that I think is true, or I can actually try to make you also believe that, and that would be more of an argument. So when you're reading an informational passage, you want to be looking for an argument that is presenting logical reasons and evidence to support a particular viewpoint. Now, you can often break down a formal argument into several different parts. First, there's the issue. That's the problem or the controversy that everyone's trying to figure out how to agree on. There's the claim. That's your position on the issue. There's support that you have for the claim. That's your reason and evidence about why you're reasonable and your claim should be accepted. There's a concession where you might admit that part of the opposing viewpoint is true. And there's a refutation where you're actually trying to prove that the other side is wrong. So argumentation is closely tied to persuasion. This is the author trying to convince the reader that a claim is true by giving supporting reasons or evidence with a purpose to change the way the reader thinks or get the reader to take some kind of action on an issue. So to break down these different parts, the claim is where the argument is trying to make its point. It's what the author is trying to persuade you to accept as true. Now, within claims, there's several different types of ways that an author might make a claim in an argument. They might claim facts. Now, facts are statements that can be proven or verified by some kind of observation or research. Another type of claim is a value claim, where you're not trying to prove a fact, but you're trying to say that this just would be better or a more desirable thing to happen than something else. And finally, another type of claim is the claim of policy. And this is where you're making a statement that a certain action should be done that would help to solve a problem. So for example, to reduce school violence, more gun and metal detectors should be installed in public schools. Your claim is that this action is going to cause something to happen. Now, in order to evaluate someone's argument, you need to be able to analyze it. This is where the critical reading skills come in. In order to analyze an argument, you break it down into the parts, examine the parts by themselves, and then look at the relationship of the parts to the other. Does one thing make sense in connection with everything else that's in the statements as well? So the first thing you look at is what kind of support did the author give to this particular claim? You look at the reasons that they have. That would be a general statement that supports the claim. You look at the evidence that they might provide, and evidence consists of things like facts, statistics, experiences, comparisons, examples that show why the claim is valid. And you might also look at emotional appeals, and emotional appeals are ideas that are targeted towards the needs or values that your readers are likely to care about. So you try to argue that by appealing to their emotions. Now, another terminology that you can look at when you're talking about arguments is to look at inductive and deductive. An inductive argument is going to reach a conclusion from observed specifics. So they're going to look at a specific series of facts and then make a general statement about it. So for example, by observing the performance of a large number of athletes, you could conclude that athletes possess physical stamina. So this looks at lots of little things, all the different athletes, and then is able to make a blanket statement about what all athletes must be like. And that's known as being an inductive way to reach a conclusion. The opposite of that is the deductive technique. The deductive technique begins with the major premise and then looks towards specific support for that. So you notice you say athletes possess physical stamina, that's a broad statement, and then because Anthony, our skier over here, is an athlete, he must possess that physical stamina. So you move from the broader down to the smaller based on that type of argument. So you have inductive and deductive arguments. So you're going to be sitting there on your final exam, and at least one or more of your passages is going to come from an informational text and is likely to have some sort of argumentation in it. So how do you read and analyze an argument in order to answer questions about it, and if you need to do the constructive response? Well, the first thing is to do a little bit before you even begin reading. Start with the title. What kinds of ideas and things do you get from that? What is the title suggesting? If that information is given, look at who is the author and what are their qualifications. Do they state that they have any area of expertise or experience in this topic? When was it published? Sometimes that's important to know the date of a publication. If you're writing about a topic like prices of gasoline, it's going to make a big difference whether this article was published last week or published 2 years ago or 10 years ago. So knowing the date of something can also help you understand how much you should pay attention to the argument. And then you can think to yourself, what do you already know about the issue? And that can help give you a framework as you start to analyze the argument that the author is going to present. So you'll start reading through the passage and you're going to be evaluating the types of evidence. Is the author giving you sufficient evidence to support this claim? You look at the personal experience. Is there some bias on that case? You don't want to accept it from the author. And then look at the examples. They shouldn't just give you examples. They should be based on facts or some sort of common experiences, or they're using an emotional appeal in order to make their case. Now, be careful of some of the ways that an author might present information. Just because they're giving you statistics doesn't mean that those statistics are really relevant. And remember, numbers can be misused, manipulated, or misinterpreted. You also want to look at the comparisons or analogies that the author uses. Those are only reliable if they actually correspond to the situation that they're arguing about. And then finally, look at the relevancy and the sufficiency of the evidence. Are they giving enough of the right kind of evidence in order to support the claim effectively? Some other things to consider while you read passages that have argumentation in them. Look at the definition of terms. Are they carefully defining and using the terms in the same way throughout the piece? Look at any cause and effect relationships that they put in. Remember that just because something happens doesn't mean that it was caused by something else. So you want to look for evidence that a cause-effect relationship exists. And look at any implied or stated value system. Now, are the arguments consistent within that specific value system that the author seems to be establishing? You can also look at how the author treats opposing viewpoints. Can you question the accuracy, relevancy, or sufficiency of their opponent's evidence? Does the author address opposing viewpoints clearly and fairly? And does the author try to refute opposing viewpoints with some sort of logic and relevant evidence? And all of that can give you some better basis for how to analyze the argument that you're reading. Now, some things that do not make for good arguments include things like emotional appeals. And this is the kind of thing that you see in advertising all the time. This may be very emotional language that's used. It may be a false authority, like an athlete who's saying, you should wear this underwear, like this underwear is going to give you the same strength as this athlete, or a movie star selling shampoo. I mean, I don't care what kind of shampoo I use, I'm not going to look like some of those cover girls. Or association with things like a car that's being named after a cougar because it's supposed to remind you of these fast, sleek animals. Or cigarette advertisements that are done next to a waterfall because it's fresh and it's nature, and all those things that you want to associate that you're not going to associate with the product otherwise. You can also look for errors in logical reasoning. Now, these are sometimes called logical fallacies. They're things that people say in an argument that sound good, but they tend to make the argument really flawed. And this includes things like circular reasoning, or sometimes referred to as begging the question. You say things like, female police officers should not be sent to crime scenes because apprehending criminals is a man's job. Like, that just kind of loops back on itself. Or a hasty generalization. This is when you come up with your conclusion, but you don't really have enough evidence yet, because one apple is sour, all of them in the bowl must be sour. So these are kinds of errors in logic. Now, as you're reading these passages on these final exams, you can also look at these things and say, what other kinds of errors in logical reasoning is the author making? There's something called a non sequitur, which is literally Latin for it does not follow. Say, because my doctor's young, I'm sure she'll be a good doctor. How are those two things connected? Or one of my favorites, correlation does not equal causation. Just because you opened the umbrella when you tripped on the sidewalk, it doesn't mean that the umbrella is what caused you to trip. And then the either or fallacy. Because of the violence, TV must be banned. Like, really? Isn't there anything in between that we could work on? So look at how the author might be trying to make a point using these, and you can look at that structure in terms of evaluating the argument. So to summarize, when you have a piece of informational text that you're reading and it seems to be making an argument, you want to identify the claim. What is it that the author is saying is true? What kinds of evidence is the author using to support this point? And then evaluate that evidence. Is there enough of it, and is it the right kind? So is it using things like research findings, case studies, personal experience, observations, examples, facts, comparisons? And then does the author recognize or even push back at all on any kinds of counter arguments? And finally, you can look at the entire passage and you can compare the types of evidence that's used, figure out which kinds of arguments you found were more convincing, how the author got to that point, and then what further information would be useful in assessing the issue. So hopefully this is giving you some ideas on things that you can do to talk about a piece of informational text that seems to be stating a claim and making an argument. And that's all for this presentation.